Okay, we have an introduction now, everybody. So it won't be quite so awkward whenever we get to start kick off the show. But now I guess it is awkward that I'm mentioning it. Anyways, this is the hotline. It's Friday. Daniel's back, everybody, from his jet-setting worldwide adventure. We're here on YouTube and LinkedIn as always. It is officially CMMC Phase 1. Only 361 days until we get to CMMC Phase 2. You can go on to CUIHotline.org and you can fill out the form over there for your questions. We have a big backlog of questions on the form, so we're getting to them as fast as we can. If you filled out your questions, we have seen them. They're in the queue. Don't worry, we will get to them. You can also call the number and leave a question over there. We love hearing from everybody. And yeah, Daniel, how the heck are you, man?
I'm great. I had an incredible time in Italy. This is the first time I've taken a vacation and not brought any ability to do work. Laptop, phone, left them at home. And did you
feel the withdrawal at first whenever you were like, you're just habitually used to doing work?
Oh yeah, because you're used to scrolling on your phone, like checking email, right? I mean, It's just like your brain just autopilots to that. And so, or Teams messages or whatever. And it's just like, oh, like I'm in an airplane. I'm like, oh, I could just work on this little proposal or or something. But no, I had no ability to access it thanks to our lovely friends at Microsoft and conditional access policies. So they did not let me access from non-compliant devices. So it is working.
Absolutely. Well, it is raining in Southern California. It is supposed to be raining for the next 5 days. So this may be my last broadcast. If you never hear from me again, it's because society has crumbled. It is already crumbling. So that just there you go. If you don't hear from me for a while, it's because the power has gone out, cats and dogs living together, and it's going to be super crazy. Anyways, Daniel's back. Everybody wants to hear from Daniel. Daniel, what's on your mind? What's on your week in review, your multi-week in review here?
Well, first, shout out to BMAT. I did get the high and tight. So I recently got engaged, and I did that while I was in Italy. So
I don't have a soundboard. Applause in chat. Applause W's in chat for the handsome devil getting engaged.
That's right. So she made sure I looked good before departing the United States of America. So I can appreciate that. So, but week in review. So something interesting. So I got back. First off, it was a lot of fun coming back in a government shutdown world back to Huntsville, Alabama, but made it back late Monday night, about 11 p.m. and hit the ground running Tuesday, coming over from some jet lag there. But the first calls I took this week were really interesting because I was thinking people are going to come hitting it hard, like, oh my gosh, CMMC's in effect. I've got to do something yesterday. And there was a little bit of that. But I was actually shocked by the amount of people I talked to that were just now exploring CMMC. And they were full-on defense contractors, full 7012, but they were just finally starting to explore like, oh, I think I should do this CMMC thing. I think our organization should do this CMMC thing. Or, hey, I'm private equity and I've got operating companies that need CMMC. And it was interesting, like their eyes kind of opened, but there wasn't the sense of urgency. Like when I brought up November 10th, they were like, yeah, we know what happened. But there wasn't like oh, we're afraid we're going to lose work. And so it's just really interesting tension of like, yeah, we know CMMC is a real thing, but there was no fear around like, hey, CMMC's like actually going to happen, right? And so I thought that was kind of interesting. And then some of the conversations were like, hey, we're going to start with CMMC Level 1. And I was like, you know what? I think that's incredible. CMMC Level 1, start somewhere. If you're only dealing with FCI, I think you've got a really good path forward here. But there's an interesting little problem here. And that is, if you're going to implement any level of cloud service at CMMC Level 1, there is no requirement for FedRAMP, as we know here on the live stream. However, if you want to use that same environment to uplift to Level 2, then you're going to have to migrate to a cloud platform that is FedRAMP moderate or equivalent, and then re-implement those controls. So if you do plan to start with Level 1 on your CMMC journey, if you're new to this, live stream or new to CMMC and you want to kind of ease into it and you don't fully have CUI requirements yet, then I would say do CMMC Level 1 in a compliant cloud environment. Then you can uplift the controls after. I was talking to a company this week that had implemented NIST 800-171. They had a score of around a 90. Now I'm just telling you kind of war stories for this week. And I was like, oh, that's fantastic. Like, that's a great job. It was a 4-person IT team for like a 700-person company. And they were like, we're really kind of bootstrapped here. We've been trying our best. We brought in a consultant, our MSP, and they're the ones who gave us the spreadsheet to score. And I was like, okay, well, let's talk about this. And I was like, does your spreadsheet have assessment objectives? And they were like, what's assessment objectives? Like, oh, okay. So I pull up in the standard 171 Rev 2A or A Rev 2 and start looking at the assessment objectives. Like, hey, if you don't meet these 6 as part of 3.1.1, then you can't actually say that you've met the control. And I was like, okay, what about cloud providers? Because they're like, they literally asked on the call, they're like, CMMC is the same as NIST standard 171. I was like, yes and no. It's like there's a cloud component to it where you have to be in a FedRAMP moderate cloud. They weren't aware that Microsoft Commercial lost their FedRAMP moderate authorization. And they didn't lose it. They just decided not to renew it for their commercial platform for M365. And so I started going through all of this kind of fun discovery with them in real time. And I felt really bad for this director of IT because he thought he'd been doing a great job and he had implemented the controls very well, just did it on the wrong cloud platform. And although he implemented controls, he didn't fully implement the justification for the assessment objectives, meaning the score is probably a lot lower than it actually is. So quick recap on the front lines. People are just now starting to explore CMMC with not as much urgency as I would think with the November 10th date. They're like, yeah, we're going to start looking at CMMC. Some people are, fully on the bandwagon of like, we've got to do something. Make sure to look at assessment objectives. Make sure to vet your cloud platform. And if you're starting with CMMC Level 1 and you plan to use cloud services as part of that, to future-proof yourself, go ahead and migrate to a compliant cloud instance before you implement those controls. You don't have to migrate and redo everything you already did for Level 1. So that is my kind of large weekend review. Very kind of different things around the CMMC ecosystem. Solicitations are, I think now that the government's opened back up, I think we're going to start seeing more solicitations with CMMC.
Yeah, I guess from everything I heard from my friends in government, they spent the whole first day back just trying to sort the time card problem because they were like just trying to figure out what to do. Just took everybody it's probably still an issue, but yeah, that was like the entire day. So people were like, I have 2,500 emails. I have 1,500 emails. I don't know how to do this timesheet. So it's going to be a minute, but I have a feeling that, that time off was like pulling the rubber band back and that we're just going to see shotgun of solicitations come out. And there's been a trickle of them that don't have CMMC mentioned in them at all. And those are prime candidates to have revisions before their due date. So yeah, it's definitely something to check out. Well, talking about starting with CMMC Level 1 and then going to Level 2, man. Okay, well, first of all, despite the name, CMMC is not a maturity model, right? It never has been, and it never honestly probably will be, because the requirements in FAR 52.204.21 do not directly lead to the requirements in NIST SP 800.171. This is a long story about how they decided which requirements go where and how things are tailored and blah, blah, blah. I won't take up the entire time talking about that, but it isn't a one-for-one step that you should do the requirements that are verified by Level 1, then do the requirements in NIST SP 800.171. If you were going to design a maturity model, you would probably pick a totally different set of requirements to do first, and then do second, and then do third. But the way that baselines get snapped into regulations a decade or more ago, that's what you get stuck with. And so when the CMMC program gets directly aligned to existing authorities, they don't have the flexibility to say, do this and then do that. You just do the thing that's already in the contract, and then you do the next thing that's already in the contract. So just a reminder, I just posted about this on LinkedIn this morning. DFARS 252.204.7020 exists. It has existed since 2020. The 2020 final rule had 2 parts to it. It had the CMMC part, and then it had the DoD assessment methodology part. The CMMC part is what got put on hold, went through rulemaking, and is now in effect for CMMC Phase 1. The DoD assessment methodology part has been in effect the entire time. That's why people have to upload scores to SPRS. That's also why there's language in your contracts that says that DoD at any time reserves the right for DIBCAC to show up and audit you against the requirements in DFARS 7012, right? This is why I'm always stressing that CMMC is not the thing making you do the requirements. It's just verifying that you've done them, because people who are waiting for CMMC to show up in the solicitation to get started on DFARS 7012 at any time can have DIBCAC show up and say, prove to us that you're doing the things that are in DFARS 7012. And man, it is a nightmare story for about half a dozen companies that I've been hearing about and hearing from over the last week. These are all companies that are less than 100 employees. These are all companies that have CUI. These are all companies like marked CUI. These are all companies that have DFARS 7012 and DFARS 7020 in their contracts. They are all companies that have uploaded scores to SPRS, and those scores are pretty close to perfect. And then they didn't do anything because one way or another, they convinced themselves that they would only need CMMC level 1, or that they would start with CMMC level 1. They either didn't understand the relationship between their existing obligations and their future obligations, between the program and the requirements, all these things that we talk about. And so sure enough, they got a notice from DIBCAC at the end of October that said, we'll be there in mid-January. So like 90 days inclusive of the holidays to run an on-site in-person assessment against NIST SP 800-171 and the other parts of DFARS Clause 7012. So they're going to be checking your FedRAMP. They're going to be checking your incident response. They're going to be checking your flow down to make sure that when you send that CUI to your subcontractors, that you're also sending the requirements downstream. CMMC assessments don't do that, right? But DIBCAC works for the Defense Contract Management Agency, so they can audit any of the terms of any of the clauses, right? So these companies reached out to outside help, and then the outside help reran their self-assessment, and their self-assessment scores tumbled by what I've been told is Did you lose me? Am I frozen?
I got you.
It's raining, everybody. It's a live show. It's raining in California, so you'll have to bear with me here. Anyways, you get this notice from DIBCAC. You get 2 weeks. You have to provide your SSP to them. You have to provide all your policies and procedures. You have to provide your POAM. You have to provide your detailed network topology and the list of people on your team who can answer all the questions during an assessment, and the people who are responsible for conducting your self-assessment and uploading the score. Then they show up like 45 days after that to conduct the assessment. So these companies are, to use a technical term, totally screwed, because even if they're able to move heaven and earth to get these things implemented before DIBCAC shows up, DIBCAC knows that the scores changed. They definitely won't be able to do any of these things, right? You're talking about, I don't know, we're going to talk about this in a minute, but it's like you're talking about going from nothing to fully implemented and assessment ready by mid-January, inclusive of the holidays, right? I mean, this is a nightmare scenario, and now to tons of companies, but it never makes the news, right? It's like the best example I could use of is in a past life, I wanted to be a firefighter. And when we were in the fire academy, they would tell us all the time, they were like, house fires happen all the time. They never make the evening news. You would be surprised how many fires happen all the time. You never hear about them, right? It's exactly the same situation. These companies are about to get stomped by DIBCAC. They will definitely experience contractual remedies, as DIBCAC likes to say, and they could very easily, depending on the level of borderline negligence, I'm not a lawyer, here they could easily be hearing from the DOJ, because DIBCAC and the DOJ work together, right? This has nothing to do with CMMC, right? Nope. So for everybody, hear this all the time. They go, CMMC is going to cost me $150,000. No, it's not. DFARS 7012 might cost you $100,000, $150,000. CMMC assessments don't cost you that much. And if you never get a CMMC assessment, you still have those costs under DFARS 7012. 100%. And if you don't believe me, just ask DIBCAC to come and audit you, and they'll tell you, hey, you got these obligations under DFARS 7012. It's terrible. I feel horrible for these companies. I don't know where they got confused.
Oh, Jacob. We lost you again. There you go. You're back. He's back,
Close
baby.
enough. Close enough. The thing that jumped out to me was they said we're level 1, so we don't have to worry about this. And so it's like, guys, 7020 exists, 7012 exists. They have existed for a long time. Separate problem. Don't get confused around the relationship between level 1 and DIBCAC pre-assessment checklist. It's pretty intense for the things that they want right away when they send you the notice. It's not like, oh, we'll see you in 6 months, or, oh, we need more time. They're like, no. We're auditing you right now. So there you go. All righty. Let's see here. Okay. Interesting question we had, I think on LinkedIn. Somebody said, will CMMC apply to existing DFARS 7012 obligations?
So when I got that message in LinkedIn, I was, took me a second to kind of connect all the dots here. But what they're saying is, if I have an existing 7012 clause on a contract, is CMMC going to be applicable to that? And the short answer is no, unless they do a contract modification. So if there's option years in play, if they want to do a contract mod, if it's a task order, right? You could see CMMC show up on task orders that are then provisioned or sent out. And so yes and no to some extent. Like right now, the current state, CMMC will not be applied to that existing contract with just 7012 on it. Contracts that we're about to start seeing being awarded will have both 7012 and 7021, 7021 being the CMMC clause. It'll have 7019 and 7020 as well. So unless you have things coming up for renewals, or you're looking at task orders of existing contracts, you're likely not going to see CMMC until you see a net new solicitation and contract award applied to that. So yeah, that's what that looks like.
Yeah. They're probably not going to mod your existing contracts. It'll be in new solicitations and contracts. But then DoD says, well, it's the same requirements that were in your previous contracts, so you shouldn't be experiencing any new costs, just the cost of assessment. So,
yep. And that's what we say all that with one caveat. Your primes can require you to do CMMC at any time because that's a private contract between you and them. But the actual government obligation contractually, that would probably wait until net new solicitations for most people.
Gotcha. All righty. Where's our backlog currently? Because lots of people have been talking about assessment backlogs, and depending on which C3PA you talk to, those assessment backlogs aren't that long. A couple of them have really long backlogs, but there's plenty of assessments available. Even coming up here pretty soon, like in December, January.
Yep.
But like we've talked about, implementation capacity is the constraint. So where are we at with this?
Right now, we're 4 to 6 weeks after procurement's complete. So once, procurement, depending on what it is, can usually take 1 to 2 weeks, give or take. And then after that, that's what our backlog's sitting at now. Scott, our CEO, was very strategic on hiring before the wave broke. And so we've been able to build a lot of capacity to be able to help organizations, because we had a feeling this whiplash moment would happen, right? Where it's like CMMC happened. We didn't think the government shutdown would happen simultaneously, but there's going to be probably a delayed catch up. I saw some LinkedIn posts to kind of what you were saying, Jacob. It's like, God bless the help desk having to reset, 100,000 passwords the day the government comes back, right? And so,
oh man, Fun fact about the shutdown: DIBCAC was working for free, so I think they're probably even less likely to entertain people's problems with them emailing them. They're like, I'm not.
Yeah, DIBCAC probably is not about any kind of grace or sympathy at the moment. Jacob, you froze in a very funny face, which I can appreciate that. All right, I'm going to keep on going here while Jacob chimes back in here in just a second. Hey, Dan, Jacob, is the CMMC Level 2 effectively ending the age of BYOD? Yes and no. So it depends on containerization. So CMMC Level 2, you can do kind of carve out on a system. Mobile devices are the easiest to do this, right? Android Work has a completely isolated profile. You can do mobile device management on it, and you can justify BYOD from that perspective. Physical workstations, not really as much unless you're using virtual desktops. The only other potential use case here, which we haven't seen this be approved yet, is something like a zero trust browser. I know there are several organizations working on this. Island Technology is one of them. Palo Alto, I think, has a solution like this as well, where we're trying to justify a containerized browser that is processing encrypted data, kind of a carve out, on a workstation that would be out of scope. So just the browser would be in scope for CUI. And so that's, people are working on that. There is no official DoD stance on if that would fall into out of scope like VDI would. But there are things like that that could potentially leave a workstation out of scope if that stuff gets approved. And so mostly, BYOD is officially dead at level 3. But level 2, there is some ability to do BYOD in at least current NIST 800-171 Rev 2 through containerization or isolation of profiles with some sort of device management associated with that as well.
Am I back? Can you hear me? Am I back?
I'm back. You're back.
All right, here we go. Let's switch questions before I black out again. Let's see here. How soon after passing our assessment can we start telling our primes and subs and adding our status to our website?
I would tell them immediately.
Yeah, as soon as you're done.
As soon as you're done, I would tell them. Now, there is this kind of interesting little faux pas of, hey, you shouldn't really be telling people, but it's also like you just earned the certificate. The real thing you don't want to do, because there's some unique identifiers on your cert, you don't want to post a full copy of your CMMC certification publicly. Announcing your CMMC certified is one thing. Disclosing that certificate to your prime contractually is another thing. But just posting a copy of your certificate, you won't want to do, because people can modify that and, use Photoshop and AI to generate their own certification that could be falsified. So,
yeah, absolutely. All righty. This was an interesting question we had on a call. Somebody was like, how do you balance compliance, CMMC stuff, and security with productivity? We want to work the same way we did before without any changes.
Yeah, this is the tension of compliance and collaboration. And I basically come back and tell people, it's like, there are things you can do to lessen the burden, but there's still going to be a burden, right? The one that's the lowest impact is virtual desktops, in the sense of having to physically bring up an enterprise to the same standard. But virtual desktop and context switching, there are changes of workflow there that might be uncomfortable. I won't even say might, they will be uncomfortable, because you're working in two very different environments to do your job. So the short answer is it's not ideal, but also you're dealing with data that's sensitive and shouldn't be treated lightly. There should be some level of friction there working with this type of information. Microsoft has things like cross-cloud collaboration, where you can talk from a GovCloud to a commercial and Teams and things like that, and vice versa, which kind of, again, helps emulate that kind of one business, you could say. There's another third-party product called Identity Bridge that allows kind of a universal gal sync between GovCloud and commercial cloud. Microsoft just released cross-cloud provisioning of being able to provision identities across from commercial into the GovCloud, things of that nature. So I would say, like, overall, there is going to be some level of friction, even if it's just having two different email domains, one in the GovCloud, one in a commercial cloud. The question is, A, do your people understand what they're doing and the need for this friction? And number two, implementing as much collaboration services as you can that still allows you to protect the CUI as it's required.
All righty, let's see here. Somebody said, how does CMMC impact Canadian companies that are working on interoperable applications and data? Well, the international question has been an open question for quite some time. Canada, I think it was earlier this year, announced their version of CMMC, but we haven't heard any updates as far as what's going on. And we certainly haven't heard any updates around reciprocity between I think it's CPCSC, the Canadian CMMC version, and CMMC. So as far as we know, there isn't any reciprocity between the two, especially because the initial information we had about the Canadian program was verifying 171 Rev 3, whereas the US version of the program was verifying 171 Rev 2. So what have you heard here, Daniel?
So if you look at the Department of War, the DoD CIO's website, they have an FAQ section, very valuable. And one of the questions is, will CMMC apply to non-US companies? Yes. When CMMC requirements are identified in the department's solicitations, they will apply to all companies performing under the resulting contract, whether domestic or international. And so this is the conundrum, right? Because FedRAMP authorized data centers at a moderate level. FedRAMP's a US standard. It's not an international standard. So how do global companies without a US address get access to the GovCloud? So just for those unaware, in order to get access to the Microsoft GovCloud, you have to have a cage code associated with a US-based address. You can still be an international company, but those two things have to exist. And so you would basically have to do everything on-prem, right? If you couldn't have access to those cloud platforms. So this is a big kind of issue right now, is how do you have this tension of there are cloud services that international companies, if they don't have US addresses, can't access, to streamline adopting CMMC, which is having to force them to do things on-prem. But the DoD basically has come out and said, you know, I don't mean this insensitively, but basically we don't care. CMMC is CMMC. This is the standard you have to play by. Figure it out. We're not going to prescribe you that you have to use a cloud provider to do that, even though it is the easier of the two options for most organizations. So yeah, if you're Canada, if you're UK, if you're in Germany, Australia, you know, there is no reciprocity as it states today. It is basically do CMMC as it is written, or just don't do defense work anymore. And that's about as clear as the DoD has made it now.
Yeah, I remember a couple years ago, there was a guy at the Pentagon who was specifically in charge of fixing the reciprocity issue. And he worked that issue for years before he rotated. But since he's PCS, I haven't heard anything about that being a major issue. So yeah, I'm really not sure. All right, let's see here. Hey, your favorite topic here. How do VDIs fit into CMMC compliance, and how much do they cost?
Great question. So VDIs, if configured correctly, so basically all you have is the emulation of the keyboard, mouse, the display on the screen, and then potential smart card redirection, right? No data written, just data read from that. And so that would kind of check the box of the out of scope asset. The smart card thing isn't in the language of the scoping guidance, but all organizations I've seen and all C3POs have approved that. And so when you're looking at VDI, it's great. It's an easier solution. They double click a link on their desktop. It logs them into a virtual desktop session hosted in like a GovCloud. However, you can't just have a VDI, and that's the end of it. So even when you're looking at Windows 365, Cloud PC, Azure Virtual Desktop, all of those things, you still have to have other virtual infrastructure running in the backend. You have to have an Azure firewall or some sort of firewall appliance to do deny by default, allow by exception. You need to have the infrastructure with virtual networks and segmentations, and you don't have to have backups, but if you are backing up CUI, you have to protect the confidentiality of that. And so when you start going through building out this separate infrastructure, you're looking at a base cost of around $22,000 to $2,200 a month in operational costs, virtual networks, the SIEM, which is Sentinel in Microsoft world. And then for virtual desktops, you have really three options. You have Windows 365, which is a dedicated license-based user seat that you would buy. You have Azure Virtual Desktop pooled deployments, which is like a shared virtual desktop. Everyone has their own unique login, but it's sharing the performance of that system. That usually rates about $15 a user a month. That's about the going rate for a basic desktop. And then you have GPU-enabled systems like NV6 for like SolidWorks and AutoCAD. Those run about $200 a user a month for those deployments. Windows 365 or cloud PCs, those can range, anywhere from, I think it's $400 to $800 a user a year, or somewhere in that. So it kind of varies across the board, but those are the different kind of price points that you're looking at from an Azure or a licensing cost. And again, you can't just spin up a VDI and be compliant. You do have to set up the surrounding infrastructure to monitor and support that as well. And that, a lot of people don't realize that they have to do that as part of it too. So.
Yeah. Well, talking about this level 1 misconception, we thought we were level 1, and then now DibCAC is busting down the door. What's the lift like going from level 1 to level 2? We heard earlier this week, somebody said, my CIO thinks we can start with level 1 and then go from there. And then if we get the requirement for level 2, we'll just go real fast and bridge the gap. Is that realistic?
Looking at, I'm actually pulling up all the level 1 controls right now because this is a fun little exercise to do. All right. So level 1 controls, I'm going to share my screen here because I think this is a good conversation to have. Access control, identification, authentication, media protection, physical protection, system communication protection, and system information integrity. When you're looking at these things, there's a couple of things that immediately jump out. 3.1.1 in the standard 171 CMMC. This is a huge pillar of a lot of things downstream. Authorization of users, devices, service accounts as it relates to the environment. So because this is such a heavy lift, there are other things downstream for authorization that kind of immediately inherit some of the things you've done here from an assessment objective perspective, which is really great to say. Physical security, there are other elements there that are also good, media protection, things like that. The biggest kind of more complex thing is security monitoring, incident response requirements. Those are heavy lifts.
Encryption requirements.
Encryption of FIPS validated certificates on your appliances. And, it doesn't cover this in these controls, but the FedRAMP thing that we talked about, right? FedRAMP's not a requirement for level 1. It's a requirement.
Not to mention the fact that nothing that you have that's FCI is going to be ITAR. So if you suddenly are like, well, now we've got all these ITAR requirements, and then you've got to go from commercial to GCC high, that's not exactly a quick move for a lot of people.
Yeah. If CMMC level 1 took you 6 weeks to do, I would assume CMMC level 2 uplift would probably take another 3 to 4 months to do on the low end, assuming no migration to a compliant cloud and you're just implementing controls.
Yeah. Yeah. So, plus, I don't know. I think betting on going fast when you need to is a little bit of a dangerous game, unless you know for sure when you're going to get that solicitation requirement in the future, which if you do, wonderful. But if you're just hoping for it, be careful. All righty. Let's see. I work for a heavy construction company that may be required to be compliant with CMMC. So far, I've read through the CUI registry and I'm struggling to define CUI as it pertains to us. What have you seen, Daniel, in terms of the CUI categories that would apply to construction firms? We hear from a lot of construction, architecture, engineering firms. These aren't necessarily, they're not dealing necessarily with the same data that a defense manufacturer would be dealing with.
Yeah, so Ryan Bonner and I did a podcast, that CMMC show, where we talked about each industry's kind of CUI obligations traditionally. So this is the DoD CUI registry. It mirrors NARA, who's the ultimate gatekeeper of this, but does provide some more context, which is nice. So critical infrastructure, under the defense category, you're looking at CTI, or sometimes infrastructure security information, if you guys can see this. There is under nuclear, depending on what you're doing, if you're constructing nuclear elements. I'm looking for operational security, tax, transportation. Let me see if I can get the full list here.
I like they changed the layout from the NARA registry just enough that they're not laid out in the same order.
Intelligence, that's what it's under. Operational security is another one that could fall into scope here. So there's several things that when you're looking at as a construction company, blueprints, engineering, site surveys, if you're going out and doing like environmental research of a specific site, building industry is considered critical infrastructure. Thanks, John. We did a podcast with John as well, from Tudor Perini. Shout out to them for getting their CMMC certification.
Heck yeah.
So you can tell critical infrastructure has a lot of subcategories there,
right,
as it relates to any kind of building potential. Again, building maintenance, and then surveys or any kind of site assessment. All 4 of those major categories could fall into scope as being CUI, depending on what you're doing there.
Yeah. All righty. Let's see here. Okay, this was an interesting question. How do you deal with, maybe not personally, but organizationally, how do you deal with the burnout, fatigue, compliance fatigue of like, hey, we got to do this. Leadership doesn't want to do it. Hey, we got to do this. Hey, we're going to push it down the road. I mean, I think probably one of the most common sentiments that we hear on calls is, borderline burned out IT security
Yeah.
personnel who are just trying to push the rock up the hill. Have you seen people deal with this? I mean, what do you think here?
Honestly, so the people that I've talked to that have been in this seat, typically IT directors or somebody in the IT side of the house, they're just tired, right? Their executives will say, hey, do this thing, then there won't be any funding for it, or CMMC will get delayed or did get delayed. We can't actually say that anymore. Snip, snap, if you guys are The Office, watch The Office out there. But, it's like, it's happening, it's not happening. And so what I've seen is lack of funding, lack of executive sponsorship outside of just go fix this problem. And what it typically ends in is that person leaving that organization because they don't want to be on the hook for failing at something that they didn't have funding or authority to operate within. And so I hate to say it, it's like some people are still in the trenches out there. I talk to them every day. They're still trying to do the right thing. They're trying to push the rock up the hill. I talked to one company that said, we're talking to you secretly because our executive said, we don't want you to pursue CMMC anymore, but we know if we don't have a plan when this happens, we're going to get fired.
Man.
And it's like, I couldn't imagine living in an organization like that.
Yeah, that's tough.
So what I say is,
I mean, good for them for doing that, but man, that's a tough situation to be in.
There's enough companies interested in your CMMC expertise out there and your technical background that are willing to put the money into you and to make it happen. It's probably worth it to maybe start looking on the job market.
Yeah, we got 25 open. We got 25 open positions on the Summit 7 website. So hit us up if you got the skills and the interest. We probably have a place for you in the organization. So let us know, and then maybe the company you left will turn around and be one of our clients, and you can have that fun relationship.
Yeah, it's real out there. So hats off to you guys that are still out there. Take a break, take a vacation where you can. But if at this point they're still not waking up to giving the right funding and staffing that you need to do it, you might want to look somewhere else because the shoe's going to drop literally any day now when someone can't go after a contract. Or, Jacob, to your point, they try and force you to self-attest to an incorrect SPRS score, and then you get DIBCAT calling and DIBCAT's putting you through the ringer, right?
Yeah, so there's no senior company official designation under anything prior to the CMMC rule. So they're having IT directors and compliance directors and HR people being like, yeah, upload this score for us, right? So that's a tough position. All right, we had a question submitted on the forum about MSP tech stack requirements. They said, I have a question related to MSP, MSSP tool stack requirements for CUI and DFARS compliance to pass assessment for our client that is a DIB contractor. Does our tech stack, so does the MSP, MSSP's tech stack need to be in GovCloud if we are not processing CUI or touching it in any way? Our tools just sit in the CUI enclave environment strictly for managing and securing the environment. We have no access to the CUI enclave, only the systems that access it, user workstations.
Okay, so no, maybe yes. And so the way that I would approach this, if your systems are not processing, storing, or transmitting CUI, which you are using security protection assets with security protection data to support that environment, that's okay and does not require you to be in a GovCloud instance. You can do that in a commercial cloud. There are no FedRAMP authorization requirements for SPA and SPD, unless that SPA is also processing, storing, or transmitting CUI. The only thing that I would be hesitant to say, so if you have a workstation that's accessing an enclave, I'm assuming a virtual desktop or some probably RDP type connection, then if you have an RMM tool that's able to do screen connect to that system, some sort of team share, screen share capability, make sure that you can't see what's on their enclave screen. Make sure that you disable screenshots from your RMM tool. And then just make sure that maybe you have consent of that system so that you can't jump in and see that stuff if they haven't already kind of shut down that window, right? So there's a few things just to be aware of, more policy and procedure driven. But yeah, I mean, if you're not processing, storing, or transmitting CUI on any of your tech stack for them, and it's just security tooling you're using, then no GovCloud requirement needed. However, you might want some policies and procedures to make sure, even some technical controls to make sure that you can't see a system with CUI on it through like a screen share.
Awesome. Let's see here. Copilot security and GCC high when?
Great question. The last I think I saw was like early December, I think is where it's now at. Post-Turkey Day, pre-Boxing Day is probably the best window of time there for when we'll see Copilot hitting GCC high.
Gotcha.
However, we did get Business Premium.
Yeah. I don't know. Let's see. I don't know. I think we had a post about it. I think the Summit 7 account had a post about it. Information's coming out about it. So definitely check it out. Like Scott has said, if it's the right fit for people, which there are some situational things that you got to consider, then it can be an awesome way to save some money.
Yeah.
Not necessarily like a magical easy button where everything will be cheaper for everybody, but for those where it's the right use case, it's awesome.
Yeah. Under 300 seats is the requirement there. So
yeah, isn't there something about G5? You have to. I can't remember what the details were. I gotta catch up on the blog myself. Something like that. Check out
Business
the post.
Premium G5 security add-on is kind of the go-to recommendation there for that. But you could still do some things with just Business Premium. But yeah, if you guys are curious, make sure to reach out.
Nice. All right, another forum question on CUIHotline.org. Can anyone clarify if metadata is CUI? Would metadata in a CSP be considered CUI and then trigger FedRAMP requirements? So, for example, would attachment names, subject lines of emails, file folder locations? I can't seem to find any real guidance on this. So is the metadata around things that would contain CUI itself CUI?
If the metadata is CUI, I know that's a really lame answer to give you, but I mean, if you're looking at like file paths, if you're looking at file names, I personally can't think of any situation where a file name would contain CUI or a file directory path would contain CUI. Because again, CUI, especially when you're looking at control technical information, it's information you can use to recreate, reproduce that thing, right, in the control technical world. And so I would say it's unlikely that metadata would be CUI, but depending on what metadata you are capturing, I can't say with 100% confidence it would never be CUI.
Yeah, my gut reaction here is no, it's not CUI, because I can't think off the top of my head of any authority that would make it CUI. That being said, like all of these questions, we'd have to double check, but my gut reaction is no, metadata would not itself be CUI. So yeah, depending on how far you interpret the metadata, could be, this would be an interesting question for Ryan Bonner for sure, but I can't see a situation based off the top of my head where metadata would be CUI. All righty, burning through the backlog here on CUIHotline.org questions. There's a form up there, so if you guys ever have longer form questions on there, then you can go ahead and submit them over there. Somebody said, can you provide guidelines about when we need to flow down the 70-12 clause to subcontractors? For example, if we don't share any FCI or CUI with them, what about if we share some FCI but no CUI? What about purely commercial acquisitions? The language in paragraph M seems a bit muddy. So
let's look at M.
Yeah, the best part about I added Dustin accidentally here. Everybody say hi to producer Dustin. He's always watching. Okay, DFAR 7012. I've never done this before, folks. DFAR 7012. This is the granddaddy of them all in terms of cybersecurity obligations. This says that if you're dealing with DoD's controlled information, then you have cybersecurity requirements. One of those is implement 800.171. One of those is if you put it in the cloud, it has to be FedRAMP moderate equivalent. One of those is if you experience an incident, you have to report it within 72 hours, blah, 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 blah. Down at the bottom, paragraph M says that if you are going to flow this control information down to your contractors, this clause also has to go with it. Sometimes you'll hear people say the requirements follow the data. So if you give people this clause, but they don't have the data, then the clause wouldn't apply. This is what really trapped people into some bad situations over the years, because this clause is supposed to go into all contracts by default, but not all contracts have CUI by default. So people would have this sort of time bomb in their contracts. They would get this controlled data in the future or be told, hey, you might receive this data in the future. And they'd go, okay, well, who's going to pay for that? And they're like, well, you already accepted the terms that said you would do it. And then they got stuck. That's a longer story. But anyways, paragraph M says the contractor will include this clause in subcontracts, which the subcontract performance involves covered defense information, blah, blah, blah. As we talked about before, the contractor determines if the information required retains its identity as CUI, which is a whole option that a lot of people don't take advantage of. Okay, so their question was, what happens if we don't share any FCI or CUI? If you're not sending any FCI or CUI, then DFAR 7012 wouldn't go because there's no CUI. And FAR 52.204.21 also has a flow down provision. There's always going to be a flow down provision at the bottom of all of these contract clauses, no matter what it is. If there's no FCI either, then this wouldn't apply, right? Then you're going to include the substance of 52.204.21 in contracts, in subcontracts under this contract and services other than commercially off the veil items in which subcontractor may have federal contract information residing in or transiting through its information system. If they're not going to have federal contract information, no 52.204.21, and therefore no CMMC Level 1 requirement. If they're not going to have CUI, they won't have DFAR 7012 flowed to them, and therefore no CMMC Level 2 requirement, either self-assessment or C3PAO assessment. They said, what about for purely commercial acquisitions? Yes, so that is one of the carve-outs that exists as a concession to industry. If the procurement is for a purely commercial off-the-shelf, a COTS acquisition, a COTS procurement here, that is not a commercial item. It is something you could go buy off Amazon. You could buy off of the shelf at Best Buy or whatever. Then the requirements don't apply, even if CUI is being exchanged. Yes, that exposes CUI in the situations where that occurs, but that's a risk that DoD is willing to accept as a concession to industry. So if it's purely for a COTS purchase, then these requirements don't apply. However, be careful because commercial items or commercial designations are different from COTS. So you can have commercial items that have been modified in some way to meet government requirements, and then that COTS carve out is no longer going to be valid. So you say the language in paragraph M seems a bit muddy. Yeah, I don't think that M is too bad, but you determine whether or not the data that you're sending is still the data that requires being controlled. And if you do make that determination, then the corresponding requirements go, either 52.204.21 or 7012, and then accordingly, either CMMC Level 1 and CMMC Level 2. But if it's not that data, which may be a determination that you make, then the requirements wouldn't apply. Have you seen this, Daniel? People,
I was just about to say, I've seen 2 companies able to negotiate this out of their contracts. 2. Everyone else I've just seen it included by default, and no one's really protested it because they don't want to jeopardize the business relationship by not accepting the contract clause.
Yeah.
When in reality, by accepting it, they kind of screwed themselves a little bit because now they're attesting to something that they're not actually meeting anymore. And so one of those interesting conundrums where it's like, we'll accept the clause because we want the business relationship. We don't fully understand the clause. And then later down the path, people are going to come and knock in, and that's going to be problematic, right? Because you've accepted something that you're actually not meeting.
Yeah.
So, yeah, problematic.
Let's see here. Oh, okay. So Garrett said that this was his question about the metadata thing. He said, I've seen subject lines in emails with CUI subject line, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, so I think that what's happening here is the CUI marking in the subject line doesn't mean that the subject line is itself controlled. I think that the subject line is getting marked by their classification tool before they're sending the email to say that the contents of the email are going to be CUI, but not that the subject line itself is CUI. So if that subject line shows up, then maybe not. Although, as John said, this kind of gets a little blurry if you start talking about project identifiers, specifications in a subject line, maybe. I mean, you're getting real into the real details here. Definitely a question I'm going to have for Ryan next time he's on the show, or definitely reach out to him on LinkedIn. But yeah, I don't think that off the top in general, right? If you see a generic email subject line and it has CUI at the start, I don't think that makes the subject line itself CUI by any means. All righty, let's see here. Somebody had a question about Entra ID. You guys heard about Entra ID and requirement 3.5.8 password reuse? Turns out Entra doesn't prohibit password reuse. Microsoft tech support claims it's by design. Seems like an issue. Any thoughts here, Daniel?
No, not at the gate. I have to message our team on that one, actually.
Yeah, we haven't had this issue come up in assessments by any means. I have not heard this come up as an issue, so I would definitely ask them for sure. I don't know if Caleb's watching, if he's in the chat or not. But yeah, this hasn't been an issue for us, so I'm not saying it's not an issue, but whatever our team is doing on the back end it hasn't bubbled up where I've heard about it as being a recurring problem. Yeah, shoot us a message, Matt, and we'll dig in on that internally and see how they're dealing with that. Okay, let's see here. Somebody said, define the statement retains its identity. Yeah, so the language in the clause here in 7012 says, the contractor shall determine if the information required for subcontractor performance retains its identity as covered defense information. So if you scroll up to the top, they give us a definition of covered defense information, and they say, it's unclassified controlled technical information or other information as described in the CUI registry that requires safeguarding or dissemination controls pursuant to authorities. Controlled technical information are the information with military or space applications subject to controls. Controlled technical information would meet the criteria for distribution statements B through F using the criteria in DoD Instruction 5230-24. So you, the contractor, get to make the determination as to whether or not the data that you are going to be flowing down to your subcontractors is going to retain its identity, if it's going to continue to meet the definition of covered defense information, controlled technical information, so on and so forth. If you make the determination that what you're flowing down does not meet those definitions, then you can make the determination that it's no longer CUI, it's no longer covered information, it's no longer controlled. And so the requirements don't apply. Obviously, that's a big decision. So you're taking on a lot of liability by being the one who makes that decision. And that's primarily the reason why I think a lot of people don't make that decision. Because if something goes awry, if DIBCAC shows up to check your flow down, right? Very good example that we don't usually talk about. Usually what we talk about here is we say, well, people don't want to assume the liability in case something goes wrong. At the top, we talked about DIBCAC's out here running assessments under DFAR 7020, and they're allowed to look at your compliance with the other paragraphs of DFAR 7012, unlike CMMC that really just looks at 800-171 requirements, which is one paragraph of DFAR 7012. And in their little pre-assessment statement that I posted on LinkedIn, where they talk about the requirements that they want to hear, they want to ask you about how are you governing the flow down process. So if you've made the decision, this isn't controlled and classified information anymore, we're not flowing the requirements down, DIBCAC's going to ask you, how did you make that decision? Why did you make that decision? Maybe they don't agree with that decision, and then you've got a whole other can of worms. So I think a lot of people don't know this line even exists in paragraph M. Those that do, I think they just don't want to deal with the liability of paragraph M. All righty, let's see here. Somebody said, Scott said, Scott said, there is not a control for password length. So when we move to revision 3, it's a problem. I think this was in relation to the Entra ID question. Yeah, they're going back and forth saying Entra ID password controls are a problem. So we'll have to do a longer conversation here in terms of what's going on with password control and Entra ID. All right, I think we got everybody in the chat so far. Let's see here. All right, another question on the hotline here. We got another 5 minutes or so. We can do some more of these. Somebody said, we are a small business, about 400 employees, readying our CMMC Level 2 assessment. Let me take this banner off real quick. Okay, small business, getting ready for CMMC Level 2. Looking forward, we continue with what constitutes significant change.
Oh, boy.
As we anticipate likely growth to our organization and continuous improvements to our cybersecurity posture. Welcome back from vacation, Daniel. Is it conceivable that some type of Delta C3PAO assessment within the 3-year certification window might be acceptable in the future to reduce the time and cost, I assume, of significant change assessments. How do the primes handle this? Do they have to recertify on a continuous basis? Or is there an acceptable way to build in some expansion capability within your current system policies supporting documentation for significant change? I think you wrote a whole blog on this recently, right?
I did, yeah. So there's murmurs that the DoD is going to provide, or DOW is going to provide, some guidance, some clarification around significant change. And I'm kind of bummed that it got to this point, because it's a little more fluid right now. When the DoD or DOW gets a little bit more prescriptive with it, there's going to be less loopholes, let's say, right? Or ability to interpret. So significant change right now is significant architectural changes, expansions of networks, mergers and acquisitions. Those are like the 4 highlighted items. Operational changes, like increase, decrease of quantities and, number of things, et cetera, wouldn't be impacted by significant change. So the one thing that I would say is, number one, you need to internally define what significant architectural changes are to you. Mergers and acquisitions make sense, because in order to register a net new cage code with your CMMC certification boundary, your CMMC UID, you have to go through another assessment, because the assessor has to upload that to EMAS and do that tie-in, basically, through the back end. So that kind of part makes sense from a reassessment perspective. But significant architectural changes, I would challenge your team internally to define what that means to you. And then through your change control process, review that information. And then at that point, you can deem if it's significant or not. That's what I would do. If there is, DoD, DOW guidance, then I think that it's probably going to be a little bit more constrained than that. Maybe it'll provide more detailed examples of what's considered significant change. But yeah, that's the recommendation today, is define it internally for your organization until additional clarifications provided by the DoD.
Yeah. It's funny. I was going back through doing some research on significant change, where I was going all the way back to the original 853 document, because you can kind of get an idea of how these controls evolved over time by going to their original versions. And back in the day, when they had the original versions of 853, significant change was an ODP, where they were like, you define what a significant change is. So it didn't show up until, I think, the 837 was there. In terms of establishing the RMF, like the language that you were talking about in terms of what constitutes significant change. Forever, NIST never defined what it meant, mostly because their assumption was people would be self-interested and self-motivated to be continuously assessing their compliance and their implementation and the status of everything that they had built around the system. That assumption, like a lot of NIST assumptions, is wrong, where people only do the assessments when they have to. They only do the requirements that are required. And so now the pressure, like you were saying, is on the government to define what a significant change is for you. And that's going to drastically narrow the ability for us to like loosely interpret what significant meant. So yeah, it's going to be very interesting to kind of pull that thread through history about how NIST originally envisioned people defining significant changes for themselves, and then now forcing DoD's hand to define it for us, right?
Yeah, that's gonna be way more prescriptive. It's funny, you have 2 camps, even when you look at Rev 3, right? Define the ODPs or don't define the ODPs. It's like, don't tell us what to do, we'll define them ourselves camp. And then there's the no, please prescribe us the answers to all of the things, right? We want to do it right. And significant change just took that same path, where it's like people in one camp was like, hey, don't really clarify what significant change is. You have some people saying, no, please clarify it. And we're now in the please clarify arena here, I think, before too long. And it'll end up being more prescriptive, and that will probably end up costing you potentially another assessment within your 3-year window, depending on what the DoD says.
Yeah, it's definitely a thorny issue for sure. All right, last minute or so here. Eli had a question about 132 CFR 170.15, level 1 procedures and assessments, artifacts in SPRS. Artifacts must be kept for 6 years. Blah blah blah. I'm being told this only applies at level 2 C3PAO assessment, and not part of reporting an SPRS. Whatever is used in support of that claim must be kept for 6 years. Let's see. So I think this is a multi-part question, so we'll pick up on the rest of it next week. But under 170.15 in 32 CFR, so this is CMMC program policy 32 CFR 170.15. They outline the, everything under CMMC level 1. And then down at the bottom, they talk about artifact retention. The artifacts used as evidence for the assessment must be retained by the organization for 6 years from the CMMC status date. Let's see. I'll go back and reread your question, Eli. We'll probably kick off next week with this question. But yeah, any artifacts that you use as evidence for proving to yourself that these requirements were implemented in order to make your attestation at CMMC level 1, those artifacts have to be retained for 6 years. This isn't just a level 2 thing. It's also at level 1, which, as we talked about in the past, they talk about in the final rule. That was DOJ's recommendation for the final rule, was that people have to retain the artifacts for 6 years. So hang on to your evidence that you use to make your decisions there. Alrighty, everybody. Usually the rain in the background is just a joke, but it is actually raining here. Apparently it's affecting internet more than I thought it would, so I got to go troubleshoot that. Daniel, welcome back. Good to see you again. Here we are in the new normal of CMMC Phase 1. We're going to keep doing hotlines every Friday. We're going to keep doing podcasts, putting out tons of content. You can follow us on our blog. You can like and subscribe on our YouTube channel. We're always putting stuff out on LinkedIn. You can find us at CUIHotline.org. And you can leave us a message up there. You can send us a message through the form. We got pretty far through the backlog of questions that have been submitted, but there's still more. If we didn't get to your question today, we'll add it to the queue for next week. And yeah, thanks for stopping by as always, and we'll see you guys next week.
See y'all.